Hello and welcome to this episode of Lake Orion Sports Update. I'm Kevin McCormick. We're going to be bringing you the latest news in hockey, basketball, and so much more coming up right now. The first weekend in February was a big one for the Dragon hockey team. The team played in the MIHL Prep Showcase, the largest high school hockey event of the year. 42 teams from around the state competed in the showcase. Lake Orion's first opponent of the weekend was the University Liggett Knights. The Dragons had a good first period, scoring 2 even-strength goals, but the Knights were able to infiltrate Lake Orion's defense and score their own goal. Gabe Podek and Thomas Reith were the scorers for Lake Orion, giving them a 1-point lead going into the second period. The Dragons were unable to add to the score in the second, but Liggett was able to tie the score at 2. The teams were unable to break the tie until the third quarter, when the Knights scored one final goal and took a 3-2 win over the Dragons. The next day, the Dragons faced off against the Livonia Churchill Chargers. The score was very close throughout the entire game. The first period went by without a single goal from either team. At 14:29 in the second, Lake Orion's TJ Hirschfield successfully found the back of the Chargers' net on a power play with a little help from teammate Lucas Barber, giving Lake Orion a 1-point lead. About 4 minutes later, Churchill's Carter Swinder broke through the Dragon defense and tied the game. The tie continued until the final period, 17 minutes of back and forth, but the score remained tied, sending the teams into overtime. A victor was not decided during the extra 5 minutes of play. That forced a shootout. Rounds 1 and 2 went by with misses by both teams. At the start of the third round, Lake Orion's Connor Graham managed to get the puck past the Chargers goalie, Chris Sergerson. Churchill had a chance to respond, but Dragon goalie Reed Marshall blocked Zach Viniletti's shot, giving Lake Orion a 2-1 victory. On February 7th, the Dragons continued their regular season with an away game against Troy United. Lake Orion got off to a strong start, earning 2 goals. The first was a shorthanded goal scored by TJ Hirschfield. Nick Bergerman scored the second goal with assists from Jimmy Dahl and Oliver Hagman. Lake Orion was able to keep Troy scoreless and then entered the second period with a 2-0 lead. Troy cut Lake Orion's lead in half when they made it on the scoreboard. The Dragons didn't get a chance to respond until the final period of the game. Troy got a goal past the Lake Orion defense, but the Dragons scored 2 additional goals to take a 4-2 win. Gabe Podek scored the third goal for Lake Orion, and he was assisted by Jared Strauss and Connor Graham. Jacob Helzer earned the Dragons' final goal with an empty netter. Lake Orion remains in the number 2 spot in the OAA Red Division with 17 points and an 8-1 Red record and a 14-6-1 overall record. Troy is sitting at the top of the division with 18 points, a 9-2 Red record, and 14-6 overall. Stony Creek is third in the division with 12 points. They're 6-12 in the Red and 11-9 overall. The girls varsity basketball team headed to Bloomfield Hills on February 2nd for an away game against the Blackhawks. Lake Orion kept up with the Blackhawks pretty much throughout the game, outscoring them by 3 points. The Dragons began slipping in the second, however, when Bloomfield scored 10 more points, sending them into the second half with a 29-22 lead. The Blackhawks continued to lay on the pressure after halftime, scoring 7 more points at Lake Orion. Sadly, that trend continued into the fourth quarter of the game, and Bloomfield took the win 57-40. Sydney Stringer led the way for Lake Orion with 16 points. She was followed by Peyton Shaddai with 8 and Katie Janis with 7. Next up for Lake Orion was a home game against the Rochester Adam Highlanders on February 6th. The score was extremely close throughout the first half of the game, with the Highlanders holding an 18-16 lead. After halftime, Lake Orion was fired up and ready to take the win after a long losing streak. The Dragons outscored Adams by 7 in the third quarter, bringing the score to 28-23 in Lake Orion's favor. The Highlanders attempted to catch up to Lake Orion, but the Dragons were able to maintain the lead and won the game with a final score of 42-35. The leading scorer for this game was Sophie Wyborski with 17 points. Shadiah chipped in 10, and Stringer contributed 8 of her own. The victory leaves Lake Orion with a 4-12 record so far in the season. The boys varsity basketball continued their season with a home game against the Royal Oak Ravens on January 30th. Royal Oak took a quick lead in the first, scoring 3 more points than Lake Orion. The second quarter was a much different story. The Dragons ramped up their gameplay and outscored the Ravens by 14, bringing the score to 34-23, giving the Dragons the lead. Scoring slowed down after halftime, with Lake Orion getting 1 more point than Royal Oak. The fourth quarter was intense, with both teams fighting to come out on top. They both scored 18 points, but thanks to the Dragons' earlier lead, Lake Orion won the game 60-48. Nate Talbot scored the most points on the Dragon squad with 24. Teammate Jamie Lewis was not far behind with 17. And next up for the Dragons was an away game against Farmington on February 2nd. The score was fairly close, but Lake Orion kept a steady lead in the first half, getting a 32-29 lead going into halftime. The Dragons kept up the lead going into the third quarter, but the Falcons bounced back in the fourth, creating a tie in the final minutes of the game. The teams went into overtime to try and find a winner. The score was close, but Farmington outscored Lake Orion by 4 and won the game with a final score of 80-84. Lake Orion junior Nate Talbot led the way with a career-high score of 37 points. He was followed by seniors Jamie Lewis and Pierce Burke, who each chipped in 24 points. That wraps up this episode of Lake Orion Sports Update. Tune in next time for more winter sports coverage. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.